Okay, so for your first lecture, Professor Alfaro said something about thinking like a coder and about how it's different than other subjects. So we will be exploring that a little bit in this video. So there are 3 steps that actually help me a lot in the ICS series, and it's actually pretty simple. So the first step is to identify the problems and break it down to very simple tasks. Number 2 is going to be reflect on what you know about Python and what you can do with Python to actually solve it. And number 3 is implementing that and just doing trial and error. So let's look at our prompt right here. So it says write a program that gets an integer from a user and tells them if it is odd or even. So let's break this down to 2 simple tasks. So number 1 is that we're going to have to get something from the user. So gets a integer from the user. So this indicates that we're going to have to use input, which is step number 2. Reflect on what you know about Python, and I know that input can get stuff from the user. Now you haven't touched on this yet, so don't worry about it. This is just exploring about the step-by-step process that I would do to solve this. And our second task is to tell them if it's odd or even. So we have 2 problems that we have to solve here. 1, we have to be able to get something from the user, and 2, we have to be able to tell if an integer is odd or even. And then let's implement that. So you haven't learned this yet, but there's this thing called modulo in Python, which looks like a percent sign. So what it does is it gets the remainder of a division. So let me show you that in action. So 2 divided by 5. Let's actually write this out. So 2 can go into 5 2 times. So you write 2 right there, minus 4, and we get 1, right? Pretty simple. But modulo is very interesting. So it actually stops there. It doesn't care about the answer itself. It only cares about the remainder 1 right here. And if I shift to my computer, you can actually see that in action. All right, so here we are in Python, and we're going to be doing that problem that we just did. So we're going to use the print statement to show what the answer is down here. This is called the output, and this entire program is called an IDE, which is where you're going to be coding, but in 31 you're mainly going to be doing Zybooks. So if we do 5 modulo 2, then we should be able to see 1. Great. Knowing that, let's actually write down what we know about this problem. So 1, we have to get a number, well, more specifically integer, from the user, and I should use proper grammar, integer. And then number 2, we have to determine if it's odd or even. So knowing the properties of modulo, we know that, well, I know that modulo can get remainder, right? So let's explore properties of odd and even numbers. So 4 divided by 2, or 4 modulo 2, right? That should be 0. Interesting. 5 modulo 2, as we know, is 1. 10 modulo 2 is going to be 0. And 11 modulo 2 is going to be 1. So what does this tell us? This tells us that 2 can divide to any even number, and the remainder will always be 0, while there will always be a remainder if it's an odd number. So we just did step 2 right there. So step 2 is how can we use Python to solve the problems. So we can use Python. 1, we can get the input from the user, and we can put a little prompt in here that says, please give me integer, right? And you don't know this yet, but input automatically converts stuff into string. We will learn more about that later. I might make a video later too. But for now, we need to convert it into an integer by putting int on top of here, surrounding it by brackets or parentheses. So we're going to be using Python to determine if it's odd or even, and we know that any even number modulo 2 should equal to 0. So let's do that. So if x modulo 2 is equal to 0, then we would be printing even. And we don't need to do like an else if it's equal to 1. We can just do else. So if it's not 0, then it has to be odd. And let's see this program in action. So it says, please give me an integer. Look down here, actually. You notice how it's kind of weird. We have to type right here. That's actually because I forgot to do a \n here. So let's actually cancel the program. You're going to see some red text. Don't be scared. We're going to run that again. And you see what that \n does is we go into a new line. This is called a new line. So this is line number 1, and now we're on line number 2, which is where we can respond. This just looks a lot more cleaner, and I forgot to automatically do \n. So let's try the number 4. All right, cool. It gives us even. What about 1? It gives us odd. Let's try 23. Odd. Okay, cool. So our program works. Now, there's actually some things wrong with this program that we are not advanced yet to touch into, but this is something to think about. So some things to think about is what happens when the user does not put an integer. What if they put hello? And simple answer, this will crash our program because integer cannot, the function integer that is outside right here cannot make a word into a number. That doesn't make sense. And as you go on in the weeks, there will be things that we can do to prevent this. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The 4th step that I didn't write down is to try and improve your program. And right now we have many ways to improve our program right here. We can make sure that the user does not put a float, which you'll learn as well, or a string. So yeah, that is how my mind would go whenever we're trying to solve something like this. So just to recap, number 1, identify the problem and break it down to very simple steps. Number 2, reflect on what you can do with Python and see how it relates to the problem. And number 3, trial and error. Hidden step number 4 is when you actually solve the problem, and now we're just refining everything to make the code more efficient. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions.